Oh, it's okay. Call to order a regular meeting for the normal local liquor commission. I always have a hard time saying that. Please call the roll.
Mayor Coos?
Here.
Mr. McCarthy?
Here.
Mrs. Cummings? Mr. Nord?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Here.
Mr. Preston?
Here.
First item of business is approval of the minutes of the regular meeting of July 1st, 2019.
Move approval.
Thank you.
Second.
Any adjustments or corrections? Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Coos?
Aye. The minutes are approved. We have one complaint and citation settled case report, and that is against Schnucks Market Incorporated, doing business as Schnucks at 1750 Bradford in Normal. They furnished a guilty plea of furnishing alcohol to a person under 21 years of age. A stipulation, guilty plea and settlement was proposed. Settlement arrangements are in progress. We have an application for a new liquor license. That's Fine Eats LLC, doing business as Blono Pizza Company, 1304 Cross Creek Drive in Normal. And it was only a matter of time before somebody named their business Blono, wasn't it? Motion for approval, please.
So moved.
Second.
It's for a Class D license, all liquors on premises consumption, and a video gaming license. And is there discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Coos?
Aye. The license is approved. Item 6 is a report on second installments of license payments. 7 licensees elected to pay their fees in 2 installments. All liquor license holders have met the September 30th, 2019 deadline. A motion for adjournment, please.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Mayor Coos?
Aye. We are adjourned. Call to order a regular meeting for the Normal Town Council for October 21st, 2019. Please call the roll.
Mayor Coos?
Here.
Mr. McCarthy?
Here.
Mrs. Cummings? Mr. Nord?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Here.
Mr. Preston?
Here.
We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have one request for public comment tonight, and that is from Jeff Fritzen. Oh, here you are.
14 Hampton Drive, Lowell. While I realize under general orders, the zoning text amendment consideration is simply to send that to the Planning Commission for public hearing and perhaps later action. And it's kind of a placeholder in case the determination is made to go forward with allowing cannabis facilities in the community. My sense of it is that's not necessary. I think based on the history of Normal and recent history of different actions taken by this council and Bloomington's council related to the general health and welfare of the community, that the obvious direction to take regarding recreational cannabis facilities, whether it be production-related facilities or a dispensary, the proper action is to opt out. And I think that can be determined without sending it to public hearing at the Planning Commission or without them considering different zoning aspects. I sent late this afternoon an email to each of you and your colleagues on the Bloomington Council. Tonight I've distributed a packet of information that includes that email plus some supporting articles and the things that I've collected over the last several years, as I had a even keener interest in this subject matter up until a few months ago. And anyway, I would encourage you to go ahead and consider what you know and either table the action tonight or vote no. I don't see any urgency because the state statute goes into effect January 1, doesn't mean immediate action has to be taken locally. And I think this is something that is such a weighty matter that I think maybe more input, more discussion prior to initiating any action to go forward would be beneficial. Thank you.
We move to the omnibus agenda, items considered routine in nature and will be handled with one vote unless a council member would like to pull an item for discussion. Ms. Lorenz?
Yes, I would like to pull item C and D.
Item C and item D.
Yes, please, thank you.
Ms. Smith?
Item E, please.
Mr. Nord?
Item B.
B?
B.
B as in boy, correct?
B as in boy.
Yeah, I just had a hearing aid go south, so I'm a little slow on the uptake here. Items considered under the omnibus agenda tonight are approval of the minutes of the special joint meeting of September 30th, 2019, approval of the minutes of the work session of October 7th, 2019, and approval of minutes of the regular meeting of October 7th, 2019, and an ordinance to allow parking on the north side of Beach Street from Chuck Murray Drive to Towanda Avenue. That takes us to item B, which is a report to receive and file Town of Normal expenditures for payment as of October 16th, 2019. Mr. Nord?
I so move.
I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, we've got to have a vote. I'm a little slow here tonight. Please call the roll.
I still need a motion.
Yes.
We need a motion and a second, which I have not done. Thank you.
Second.
Please call the roll. Here, I'm just going to hand this over to you.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The omnibus is approved with the exception of 4 items. The first is item B, again, a report to receive and file Town of Normal expenditures for payment as of October 16th, 2019. And Mr. Nord, you moved approval?
I so move.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
I see there's another sponsorship. Where's the policy, or is there a policy stating where to draw the line for groups which get sponsorships versus groups that don't?
There is no formal policy. So much of the sponsorships we are paying through our general expense line are things that have been sponsored for years.
Okay, then I'd just like to note, maybe we could talk about that during our budget session, see if we can make
This is
policy.
the issue regarding the Illinois Symphony, correct?
That is one, but
Okay.
there's been other sponsorships since I've been on board.
Okay, fair enough. Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. Item B is approved. Item C is a resolution to waive the formal bid process and accept quotes totaling $89,478.45 from Dell for the purchase of computer equipment.
Yes, I'd like to move for this resolution, please.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Lorenz?
Yes, so question that I, from time to time, have on these items like this where we are waiving the formal bidding process is to just shine light for a minute on the reasons that are oftentimes needed to exercise in order to waive. And so I know that in the past, when I've asked about this, maybe it's been something unique or, maybe there wasn't somebody else, multiple bidders available. This particular item seems to center around the need for standardization on the Dell product. So I just wanted to ask the question as far as, is standardization one of those legitimate reasons to waive the process? And in this case, do we know that standardization is a requirement, that there isn't some other avenue whereby you would achieve the same end? So if you could just comment on that a little bit.
Sure, I'll start, and I'll invite Vasu forward if we have further questions. But standardization is a significant reason for asking council to waive the formal bidding process and replacing a portion of our computers with similar Dell brand computers. We work directly with Dell. I will point out that Dell is a member of a purchasing program. So not the state of Illinois joint purchasing, but other joint purchasing programs that we are members of. So we could work through that. We did compare pricing, and the prices are better than what they had originally quoted. So we're comfortable in the pricing that we're recommending. The Information and Technology Department manages about almost 400 individual computers. And so as much as we can standardize and be efficient in that way, it is very helpful. We also have been for years replacing a portion of our computers at the time that their warranties expire. Because what our experience had been, if you hold them past the warranty, then it takes a lot of staff time and equipment to keep them running again. And we know that when our computers aren't functioning, it's very difficult to be effective and efficient for those that are trying to get their work done. So we replace a portion of our computers each year to continually have a replacement program annually. And we're asking council to continue with the Dell product for efficiency and standardization purposes, and because we believe we have a very competitive price from Dell. And this would take care of the fiscal year 1920 replacement program.
Okay. So, and just one quick follow-up, the pricing they feel is competitive based on what again? You mentioned it.
Based on the original quote we received from them, and then we negotiated that down.
Okay.
And comparing that to the joint purchasing pricing.
Okay. The joint purchasing pricing we're not taking advantage of.
Right.
Or is it not,
Right,
is
we're
it
not
not
even
available?
recommending it through the joint purchasing program because their price was so good.
Okay, okay. All right, fair enough. Thank you for that clarification.
Ms. Smith?
I think you meant to say 2019 and not 1920.
2019/20 fiscal year, the
Okay.
1920 fiscal year.
My husband's a computer geek in my household, and he thought you got a really good price on the 75 computers. But I'm assuming that you looked at the individual components within the bid as well? it wasn't just the total, your IT staff was picking apart the components of the pricing?
Yes, they work closely with the Dell rep and go through every detail of the bid or the quote.
And is the same hardware in use not only by city administration, but by our police and fire as well? Or do they get their equipment independently of your offices?
No, they don't. This acquisition is for the entire organization.
Okay.
So the computers that will be replaced through this acquisition will be across the board. Could be some computers in administration or finance or police. Could be a public works. I'm not sure who's got the oldest ones right now.
Okay, thank you.
Further on this item, Mr. Nord?
Does Dell have a longer warranty? If the warranty is what's driving the 4-year time frame, do we know if Dell has a longer warranty that we could extend it out further?
I do not know. I will ask Vasu, since she authored the report, I'll invite her to come forward and see if she's got anything to offer for that.
I'm probably guessing here, but my sense is there are extended warranty policies, but most people find those to be money not well spent.
Yes, that is correct. Actually, there is a 5-year warranty for an additional cost, which I believe in the past has been evaluated, and 4 years is what was decided.
The request for the next time we do this, if we can, because I guess we're going to be doing this every year, if we could look at the warranties and then do just another evaluation to see if things have changed, because the computers may have become more reliable and maybe they will last longer now. I don't know when that last evaluation was done.
I think you have to take into account staff time to do that, and there is a cost associated with that. Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Item D is a resolution authorizing a contract with Freehill Asphalt Incorporated for the 2019 concrete pavement crack and joint sealing contract, and that's in the amount of $74,540. Ms. Lorenz?
Yes, I'd like to move this resolution for the contract with Freehill.
Thank you. Ms. Lorenz?
Okay, on this one, the issue that caught my attention on this is that we really didn't, although the intent was there to get multiple bidders, we ended up with only a single bidder. I really want to commend staff for a very well-written report, because I sensed from the report that there is frustration perhaps on your part too, that we didn't have multiple bids, because you went to great lengths to explain who you contacted and why the various different bidders chose to bow out. That being said, my response to this was, this is crazy. I mean, we are really seeming to develop a pattern here on a number of projects, most of them public works related, road work related, that we end up with just one bidder. And so I trust that staff is aware of this, obviously, and concerned about it as well. And I just felt that it was important to raise it from this position, that we seem to be running into a pattern of single bidders, and that just doesn't feel right to me. And so I would just offer up as a request that of staff, that if there's anything we as council can do to work with you, if there's any ways that we can maybe restructure projects, together, staff and council together, something that maybe will mitigate this seemingly increasing problem.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nord?
I would like to echo Ms. Lorenz's sentiments, and I fully agree with you. I'm glad you brought those up. A question. Rab Road, east of Linden, didn't they just have similar work done?
Well, Mr. Aldrich can describe the work that was done. It was different work. The work just immediately east and immediately west of Rab Road that was done this summer was done in-house. And this work on Far West Rab, west of Main Street, is different. I'll let Mr. Aldrich explain.
Right, so we did the work on East Rab, just east of Linden, so that was done with Public Works crews. You may have noticed our crews are doing more of that type of work, where it's patching and really limited crack sealing, because our ability to crack seal is limited to cold pour type of material, and we really prefer the hot pour methods as is proposed in this contract with Freehill. So we're really proud of the work we've been doing on some of the major roads, and happy that we can perform that work and don't have to contract it. So we've been really proud of that type of work. But no contractor was associated with that. If there were, and we were dealing with them, we'd certainly invite them to bid on this project. We did everything we can do to find contractors. As we publish on our website, a lot of the other agencies like Dodge, you may have heard Dodge, and other plan rooms do pick up our plans and make it available to other contractors. It's just with a lot of public works type contracting, it's very difficult because of mobilization and other issues for these types of contracts, and especially for a contract of this type, which is very specialized. This contractor, Freehill, is active in the community. I think they've been doing a lot of work at the airport recently, and are very well respected in that work. And who knows? I mean, some of these things I can't answer. There's talk behind the scenes perhaps, and other things that happens with contractors that we really don't have any control of. But there are opportunities that could be promoted by the council and other agencies promoting small businesses, for this type of work. This is the type of work with a little bit of capital outlay that some small businesses could potentially perform and be very successful at. So that would be something to encourage for these types of contracts.
Is this a similar issue that Bloomington faces as well?
Yeah, I think we're all dealing with the same issues for public works types of contracts. Again, different methods of performing the work. Bloomington doesn't tend to do much of this crack sealing type work, whereas the airport does. There's different philosophies there, but in general, yes, for public works types of contracting, we're dealing with the same contractors, whether it be asphalt or concrete, things like that, for the bigger contracts. But again, I think there may be opportunity for smaller contractors to get in the market, through some incentives or some ways to work with small businesses.
I think that's a great idea. Ms. Reese, if you could pass that on to our EDC folks, hopefully that'll help both our towns.
I'd add to that, and it's somewhat anecdotal, but talking to some of the developers of large private commercial properties in the community, they face the same issue. They're disappointed by the number of bids that they get from their subcontractors. They feel that the bid environment is not very competitive because the number of people bidding on projects is very, very small.
Thank you.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Item E is a resolution waiving the formal bid process and authorizing the city manager to execute an agreement with Tyler Technologies for the development and implementation of an electronic citation program, and that's at a cost up to $70,280.
I move this item.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
And I had forwarded some of my questions to Ms. Reese, but I hadn't seen the responses before closing down my system for the meeting tonight, so I apologize, and I do hope that you're prepared to answer. My question on this is that you had a checklist with the features from Tyler Technologies and the two other vendors, but there were no dollar amounts quoted. Was that in part because the features that Tyler Technologies was bidding on were so distinct that it would have been an apples to oranges comparison?
I'll let Chief Fleischner respond to that.
The list of items that we have in the packet, those were the things that we evaluated all of those 3 vendors against. And so, yeah, we had identified those. We felt that those were important characteristics, either to save efficiencies in migrating information across multiple systems or in staff time efficiencies. And so as we worked through those, that was what we gauged the 3 vendors against.
And am I correct in assuming that whatever software Tyler Technology has is their own product, and it is not a standard software that could be easily adapted if we become dissatisfied with Tyler Technology and decided we didn't like them, that we would go start from scratch if we switched vendors?
And that's the case with all 3 vendors. They have proprietary software. Where we would see some savings would be on staff time, because as we start the process, we would be working through how the workflow goes from the beginning of the citation all the way through the delivery of that information. And so once that template was developed, and obviously the citation would be developed, there would be some time savings on the back end. But we decided to approach it in this manner because this is what we utilized when we rolled out our body camera program. We found it was very beneficial to work with that vendor. We had 6 body cameras that we assigned to the same 6 officers. We worked diligently with that company over a period of time to get our questions answered. And then once we were happy and satisfied with that, it then smoothed the rollout process considerably, we feel, both on our end and I believe IT's end too. And so that's our plan right now, is to start with a pilot. It worked very well with that. We will utilize 5 licenses. We will select 5 individual officers who are volunteer for this. And once the company is delivered on the concept, once they've proven to us that it works the way that they say it will, then we would work to roll it out to all the fleet, every officer, and then include additional forms.
So you wouldn't be running a manual backup in conjunction with the rollout of this 5 test ones. You'd be comparing the 5 test systems to 5 of the traditional manual citations.
We would have a dual system set up. The other system would have to continue, so that we made sure that we had auditing capabilities on all of that. As part of that pilot, we would be evaluating those 5 licenses, those 5 computers, and how many the citations or the paperwork that those officers generated to make sure that everything was accounted for. But we would also be running in the background the current system we do now for a period of time. Once we were satisfied with that and we rolled it out department-wide, that would be part of the efficiencies and savings. We wouldn't have to do that anymore.
Okay, and then I think this is a Ms. Reese question. So a change in the budget, there is a slight increase. The net amount is around $7,000. Where are those dollars currently, and do you feel like there's a flexibility to is it just going to take care of this software testing, or is it going to push over into acquiring the system, and more dollars will be needed beyond the $7,000 that's mentioned here?
Right. The $7,000 that's referenced would be the difference in the annual maintenance costs that we'll be paying, and that actually would be funded out of the IT software line, and that's where the entire organization's maintenance costs are included. So we would be rebudgeting for that in the proposed budget. The 5-year impact would reflect in that line item. For current year, I think we have funds available.
Okay.
We also have we also have funds available for the acquisition as well. We've been setting money aside and carrying it over each year for this acquisition.
That satisfies my curiosity. Thank you.
Further on the item, Mr. Nord?
Has Bloomington looked into something similar?
Well, I approached Bloomington at the request of the circuit clerk and had told them that we would be moving forward with this project, and they did their own internal analysis, and I don't believe they're interested in moving forward at this time. So that doesn't mean that they won't in the future. And there may be other agencies who want to see the program up and going, because there's not another one in McLean County. We're the first one to do the electronic citation. My guess, and I certainly wouldn't speak for the clerk, but in our conversations, you know, if that were to occur and we were to be successful in this, there may be other agencies that want to jump on board. And let me back up a little bit. State Police does do electronic citations, and they do submit that information. So they are operating throughout the state and McLean County. So,
Are they using the same software?
no, different software.
Further on the item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. We have another 4 items of general orders tonight, 3 of them which are tied together, so I would ask council to aggregate your questions if you have them when we bring up item 7. So item 7 is a resolution approving an amended preliminary subdivision plan for Blackstone Trail subdivision at the northeast corner of Hershey and Shepherd. Motion for approval, please.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Is there discussion? Ms. Smith?
Point of order. So when you're asking us to aggregate our questions, so is it okay now then to ask questions about the other items?
Yes.
8 and 9, before it becomes to a vote? So it's appropriate now to ask questions?
Right.
Okay. Then.
Generally, we've done that in the past, and it seems to keep the flow working pretty well.
I would simply like some clarification of the distinction between these 2 resolutions and the ordinance. If I could please have a better understanding of what the distinction is between the amended preliminary subdivision plan and conditionally approving the final plat for the second edition, what's the distinction is between those 2 resolutions?
Sure, and I'll invite Town Planner Mercy Davison forward. She authored the reports. Our continual reference to the original preliminary subdivision plan and then the amended plan and all sorts of things does get a little bit cumbersome and difficult to follow, so Mercy will kind of walk us through the process because these items are all 3 linked, but they're linked to the previously approved plan.
And this may help, but just in general, under the subdivision code, if someone owns a big chunk of land and they're going to develop it in multiple lots, they have to come through a process first to show us their preliminary plan for all the property that they have under their control. And that ensures the public that there will be street connections where we need them in the future, adequate stormwater detention, et cetera. We wouldn't want someone to own 80 acres and come in and just build one house at a time, and someday we may end up having landlocked property or other problems, right? So they do this big preliminary plan, but typically they're not ready to develop all that at once. So then what they'll do is they'll come back with a final plat, and that's where they're getting approval of a specific part of a preliminary planned area. They're getting certain lots approved so they can actually develop them. So when it's just a preliminary plan, the lots are not lots of record yet, they're just basically on paper. And there's a certain period of time in which if you have a preliminary plan, you're entitled to come back and get your final plat approved as long as it matches the preliminary plan. So that happens all the time, all the big neighborhoods you see. So that's essentially why there are 2 separate actions. So back in January, a concept plan, which is a slightly less rigorous version of a preliminary plan, was approved for the rest of the Blackstone Trail subdivision. So the area west of the detention basin and the whole north half of their subdivision. So a concept plan was approved, and so now this preliminary plan is coming through, and basically it just includes more engineering details. And as long as this preliminary plan matches the concept plan, which it does, that needs to be approved. And then the final plat, as usual, has to be approved for the lots that they actually intend to develop right away.
Well, I had a homeowner in this subdivision reach out to me, and before the meeting, you were able to show me the location of the proposed fire station, and that modification then alters what I assume was the first plan that was put into place. So have the lots changed in size for the remaining units that are not being taken up by the fire station?
Very minor change in the size of the lots. So the original plan showed lots that were very similar in size all the way from Shepherd to the north end of the detention basin. At that time, they were all going to be attached to units, just like you see along Shepherd. So the new plan, the lots are a similar size, but they're all going to be detached single-family homes. So that's the big difference, is that they're detached, but the lots are very similar sized.
When the developer presented this revision, were they also quoting you any information about the proposed market price of the final construction?
You know, at the time, I think it came up during the public hearing. It's certainly not something we ask about. It's nothing that the code calls for as part of the analysis at all. So we didn't have, as far as I can recall, anything in our staff reports about price points, because that can change. I mean, really what we're saying is these are the lot sizes that we're approving. If you're gonna build a detached home, it could cost anything. We don't know. So, and you can correct me if you remember my reports differently, but I mean, really the issue of price, it did come up, I'm sure, at the public hearing, but it was nothing that was part of the official approvals or part of my reports.
So has the density changed then?
The density hasn't changed since the concept plan was approved. The concept plan itself changed the density from the original plan.
Because of the loss of the lots to the fire station?
Well, I mean, the lots north, the north half of the Blackstone Trail subdivision, which you're not even really looking at tonight, but that whole area, they picked up some density up there because the lots were smaller than what was in the original plan. But it's very similar density in the area that's still residences on the west side of the detention basin.
Well, this resident was concerned about the preservation of the natural setting for this development. And while she was encouraged by the preservation of the retention pond, that her preference would be that there be one of these lots set aside for nature. And so if they are interested in that, how could the residents petition to make that part of the process? Or if we approve this plan, does that then subject the residents to petitioning directly with the developer?
Well, a couple of things. I'll say that the plan you're looking at tonight and the original plan both showed solid development from the north side of the detention basin all the way down to Shepherd. So there's no change in the amount of natural area from one plan to the next. Potentially with the fire station lot, there could actually be a bit more green space, but I'm not going to argue that that's a natural area that she would be looking for. So there's that. I mean, there's really not a change from the original plan from 2009 as far as that goes. If this is approved tonight, these will be lots that are developable. The applicant owns all of them, all 16 residential lots. At that point, the town would be out of it. You know, he would just own developable lots. And I suppose if the neighbors wanted to approach him about either voluntarily setting something aside or perhaps selling a lot to someone who just wants to set it aside, that would be, I think, their only real option at that point.
But to your knowledge, the density is not altered with this revision?
It's identical to what was approved in the concept plan in January. And as far as compared to the original plan, it's very similar, north of where the fire station lot is.
And what would be the process? Because, again, although you shared with me that they posted a sign at the entrance to the development, that they sent out postcards, and were there also notices in the press?
Yeah, so there would have been notice in the Normalite, as usual, and as you mentioned, and as we discussed, the code requires as a courtesy that we send out postcard notice to everyone who owns property within 400 feet of the properties at issue. In this case, we sent out postcard notice to far more people because we wanted to make sure everyone in the Blackstone Trail subdivision got a postcard. Now, whether or not every single person received it, I can't guarantee that, but we certainly mailed them. But then the best way to get people is to put the sign right at the entrance to the neighborhood because they all drove past that sign, I'm sure, unless they were out of town for several days. So we put it both at the entrance on Shepherd and at the corner of Hershey and Shepherd.
So is there any other communication to the surrounding property owners and the council's involvement in this development that would maybe make some of them interested in finding out about the additional actions on this?
Well, the postcards, again, would have gone to people within 400 feet, and if you think of across Shepherd, that there's really only a couple of owners across Shepherd because it's not really developed, and then ditto to the west, so not many individuals would have received the postcard notice outside of the neighborhood, but frankly, I mean, all the people that drive down Hershey and Shepherd would have seen those signs for days, and they have my phone number on them, so I do get calls, which seems to be a very effective way, honestly, like, probably better than the postcards.
So this closes the door on this section of Blackstone. All future notifications would involve the area north of that has been platted but not yet under
It's
any
been
kind of-
preliminary planned but not platted. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the case, unless for some reason the developer wanted to come back and change the plan again down here. I don't think that will happen, but yeah, with this approval, the developer is able to move forward with developing the 16 residential lots.
Further on this item, Mr. Nord?
The fire station is mentioned quite a bit in this. By voting on any of these, are we further pushing along the fire department project?
By approving the final plat, that lot becomes developable. So right now, it's just part of the preliminary plan. We already own it, so there's that. But we wouldn't be able to build anything on it until it's final platted, which is what you're looking at tonight. Now, in order to actually build a fire station, there would be another public process to approve a site plan. And so that would go through the same process that we're talking about here with postcard notice, signs, normal light publication. And that's the opportunity when people would see what the actual plan is for the site.
Okay, because when this first came to council, there was a petition of, I want to say, somewhere around 100 and some odd people that were against this whole project, the fire station as well. And I want to say the resident that contacted me as well said that there were like 50-some people that came against it. And there's other corners that potentially could have a fire station. By voting on this, we still potentially could put a fire station elsewhere, right?
We, Mr. Nord, we have purchased that land with the intention of putting a fire station there, and that was approved by this council.
But the money hasn't been approved to put the fire station there. We're not approving that, are we?
That was coming, but we purchased that land with the intention of putting a fire station at that location, and it was approved by this council.
Are we voting to put money into the fire station tonight?
No,
Okay.
we're not. Mr. Preston?
Thanks. In the report, it mentions, I think, 2 or 3 times the line that if this amended preliminary subdivision plan is substantially similar to the approved concept plan, that the town is obligated to approve it. Walk us through kind of why is the town obligated, and if the town hypothetically were not to, even though it sounds like that's not an option, what is the consequence?
I'll let our attorney talk about the consequences, but the preliminary plan, when the concept plan was approved in January, subsequent to that, the council also approved an amended annexation agreement that essentially says what you just said, that you're obligated to approve the preliminary plan.
Right. In fact, the concept plan was approved as part of the amended annexation agreement. It was back in January, I believe.
January was the concept plan. I think April was the amended annexation agreement.
Right. So in that amended annexation agreement, there was the provision that the concept plan had already been approved, and as long as the preliminary plan was substantially similar to that, then the town would approve the preliminary plan. So in this case, it would be just a matter of our contractual agreement with them, that this approval. If council were to decline this, then it would likely be something that ended up in court where we're arguing over whether the plan was substantially similar. The plans are substantially similar.
I'm just thinking back to about a year ago when I was sitting in the living room of some residents in Blackstone Trails who are, I believe, the closest to where the fire station at that time, proposed potential fire station location is going to be. And we were sitting there, and there were probably 30-some residents from the neighborhood who were getting together. Staff was there, a number of staff, both administration as well as the fire department, planning, inspections and the like, and then myself and Ms. Lorenz. And I am going back to that now because I feel like that was the start of, one, a lot of information to the neighbors, but then two, I saw out of that a lot of action and a lot of passion, frankly, by the neighborhood for this issue. Now, I understand what it is that we are voting on tonight, and we are not, rehashing a vote from January or from April. However, just on the principle of, I think a lot of those sentiments still being in the neighborhood, I am going to choose to continue to stand up for, I think, the feelings that I'm hearing from people who still live there, as a matter of principle.
Ms. Lorenz?
Well, I'm going to kind of add on to what Mr. Preston said and maybe go in a little bit different direction, but to add on to what he said in terms of the sentiments that are still pretty raw out there, there's one neighbor that would be the new next-door neighbors to the fire station who were not able to be here tonight, but I agreed to share their sentiments. They made about 4 points here. They did not care for the comment in today's panagraph that said there hasn't been any inquiries about the fire station. In their opinion, just because there haven't been any inquiries doesn't mean there isn't still concern. While the residents have mostly settled down and waved the white flag, seeing this item come up again with basically no meaningful notice. Now, I know technically we've done all of the notices that have been required, but to the citizen out there who is trying to understand, maybe not so well, the difference even between town council and planning commission, it's not crystal clear. And maybe these are some things that we sometimes take for granted. And so while they have settled down and waved the white flag, tonight's agenda item, in their words, awoken the bear again. And in general, they feel that they've been confused and disenfranchised by the process. So those are the sentiments that I think Mr. Preston is talking about. Now, a lot of this is damage that's been done, okay, leading up to January's vote, and it's settled down. But I think moving forward, particularly as it pertains to their final item, which is the design and the site plan of the fire station, they would like to be involved as much as possible in very plain language, layman's terms, what's happening, when, how, over-communicate as much as possible. And so on those sentiments, I'm tempted to stand up for them again, because I didn't like this the first time and I voted against it in January for the reasons that I felt the process wasn't as complete as it could have been. Tonight's vote on these 3 items is a very technical vote. And I dare say that if we were to vote it down, we might invoke some sort of our own version of a constitutional crisis. He mentioned something about going to court. So in many ways, these are the technicalities of a decision that was made in January. And because we live in a organized civilization, we draw lines and we record them in offices to be maintained forever and ever. And if we abandon that practice of properly recording pieces of property, we go back to prehistoric times, I guess. So, in the spirit of civilized society, we need to do these things, these technicalities. And that's the point why I think it's mentioned 2 or 3 times that we are obligated to take this technical vote. And perhaps, and most importantly, I'm thinking back to my days as a planning commissioner, where these things are very much spelled out. And, you know, you got to follow the rules. And these are the rules that we've put in place to be a civilized society. I mean, I don't want to sound over dramatic, but these are the things that are done in order to make sure that this piece of property is mine and that piece of property is somebody else's, and so on and so on. So tonight's vote, while in principle, I'm not real thrilled about the outcome of a fire station there someday, I do believe we have to follow the orderly nature of our town to properly document these changes. And for that reason, I think we really need to move forward. Having said all of that, the last point I want to make is that I'm mad at myself, and I'm going to take some blame here, that I didn't pay better attention to the fact that this was coming up through the Planning Commission. And I let those neighbors down. I didn't call them up and say, you know what, this is coming through the Planning Commission. Remember what the Planning Commission is? And I could explain it to them in layman's terms. I'm mad at myself that I didn't take that step. Each of us should be doing some part of that we feel like is within our jurisdiction. These neighbors are very upset. They continue to be upset. We need to handle them with the greatest care possible moving forward. So further on that, I would just say, moving forward, let us over-communicate.
My observation on this is, one, I think staff did a very good job explaining their communication process, and they over-communicated that. There are times that you can tell people and tell people and tell people, and they still don't hear it until things have happened. I'm sorry that this conversation has wrapped up with the fire station, because that is a totally separate issue. We have a developer before us who has purchased a piece of land and is developing a piece of land. We require certain actions from that developer. The developer has complied with those actions and done so in accordance with our code. So I think those conversations need to be strictly separated. We're not here talking about a fire station. We'll have an opportunity to talk about that when a site plan comes. We are talking about a subdivision plan and platting. And the developer has met every step of our code according to our staff, and I think that is the issue we need to be discussing here tonight. Mr. McCarthy.
I guess 2 points. One, just to sort of talk about your last point, Mayor, is obligation goes in more than just one direction. Certainly, although communication in this case, the best we can do is the best we ought to be striving for. This was a very passionate issue wherever you landed on the topic. But when we approved and took a vote on a concept plan, and then a developer and went away and spent time, energy, and dollars based on that vote, we also have an obligation to them as well. So that doesn't dismiss the passion or concern of the residents of Blackstone Trail if they feel passionately against this. I'm not attempting to dismiss those feelings if anybody is here from Blackstone Trails, but simply to say we have obligation in both directions, and knowing that language was in there when we took that vote. I guess the second part is just kind of a trip down memory lane, if you will, from some of those discussions. Some of my recollections that haven't been talked about yet tonight was in the design. We talked about natural berms and all of those sorts of things, and that we made I don't know if we would call it a promise, but we made a very public that it would be an opportunity for input during the design process of the fire station and the natural landscapes around there to mitigate as much of the concern as possible. And so I just want to kind of remind us, council, staff, that was part of the discussion as well. So if, however we describe it as surrender or moving forward or whatever, I want to make sure that we remember that, and that there's opportunity for those residents to weigh in on berms and shading and all of the things that were talked about that may be able to help allay some of those things, and that we provide a public opportunity for that to happen.
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
So,
If we were to table this for some time being, to give, I guess, the staff or the developer time to do some public engagement with the residents, to kind of inform them of what's going on, because I know I would feel more comfortable voting if the residents have been given time to understand what's going on and vote with their support rather than vote against them, especially since they've reached out to some of us and said that they didn't even know this was coming up. So instead of voting no, could we vote to table?
We could take a motion to table that would stop all discussion, and we would have to identify a date certain, which would probably be next council meeting if we were to do that.
Yeah, a motion to postpone, we can postpone it up to the next council meeting.
I'm not supportive of such a motion in the fact that we're talking about two different issues here, and we continue to mix those issues. The developer has met every criteria that we have presented to him. As Mr. McCarthy pointed out, and just now in his discussion, there are discussions about items in that subdivision that residents are unhappy about, and we understand that. But that has nothing to do with the action we're taking tonight. Ms. Smith?
The one resident of Blackstone Trails that I spoke with had a request as simple as a single lot dedicated to nature. And my understanding from talking with Ms. Davis is that if we pass this resolution tonight, then rather than the council making that request to the developer to incorporate that into his plans, we are putting the residents in a position of petitioning the developer to do that, which we certainly, I would think, have more sway with the developer than the individual residents. And barring that, having something as basic as some signs for wildlife crossings, duck crossings, geese crossings, that's the kind of nature that they were promised would be part and parcel of their homes. And these modifications are concerning them, that it is altering that they bought into, and there's a suspicion that there is nothing preventing the developer from making further modifications for the other portion of the property. And I wonder what does it really cost us for a 2-week delay to have the developer provide a forum to let people be heard and make ourselves available, if we so choose, to make sure that people feel like we are listening to them. That would be why I would be in favor of tabling this.
And I understand your concern on that people are listening, but at this stage of the game, to substantially change the subdivision, and that is a substantial change. Now, I'm going to defer to Mr. Day on the legalese on this, but we do not have the power to say at this stage of the game to tell the developer that he has to rearrange his plan.
Right, and again, we don't have any authority to amend the general concept plan that has already been approved, as long as what they're bringing back is substantially similar. And in this case, it is almost exactly the same. The only additions are various engineering details that weren't in the original plan. So to go back and require additional requirements would be a violation of the contract that we have with the developer. With respect to the wildlife that they've been promised, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. That type of wildlife preservation has never been in any of the plans, the original or any of the plans that have come before council. So to the extent that we're taking away something that had been promised is not quite accurate. But in terms of amending the concept plan now, I don't think we have legal authority outside of negotiating with the developer to see if, out of the goodness of their heart, they want to amend their contract.
Ms. Lorenz? And we're going to wrap this up and go to a vote here pretty
Okay,
quickly.
thank you. Just in in response, something, Mayor, to your comments. I appreciate the distinction that you're drawing, and wisely so, on the neighborhood versus the fire station issue. And our intent tonight is to move forward on the neighborhood and to do all the things that, you know, as a civilized society, we do to dot our i's and cross our t's and plat land. Having said that, I'm going to reiterate that I feel that I let the neighbors down in helping them understand the impact. And the impact of even a decision about the neighborhood for them brings up the topic of the fire station. And forever, these two issues, while separate technically, will be woven together for them. And so for that reason, like I said, I accept some blame for not perhaps helping them be more prepared for tonight's vote and not feeling, to further disenfranchise from our processes. And moving forward, I want to make sure that they are very involved in the site planning processes and the meetings leading up to that.
Mr. Nord?
I've got a point of order question. There's 6 of us voting tonight. What happens if the vote's 50-50?
The motion fails.
In light of that, in the conversations that we've had, I move that we table the vote for 2 weeks.
We have a motion to table. Is there a second?
That motion would be out of order. A motion to postpone can only be until the next regular meeting.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, did you say 2 weeks or 2
2
meetings?
weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Or until
Next
the next,
stated meeting.
until the next regular meeting.
So we have a motion to table. Is there a second?
Second.
That assumes everybody's going to be here next meeting? Is that?
Under your assumption that everyone's here next meeting. Is that correct?
So in other words, if we get to the next meeting, there's only 6 again, because somebody's out.
Oh, no, it's actually to give the developer time to communicate with the residents. So how he chooses to use that time is up to him. I would like to see him communicate with the residents, because that's
And help me understand what they're communicating to the residents.
just what's going on, what we're voting upon, so that way they don't feel like they're left out in the dark, because they said.
And
they
how are
just
the
realized-
residents left out in the dark by this process?
We just talked about it for a while, all the reasons that were brought up.
Mr.
I
McCarthy?
guess I'm struggling with the communication part, and how are we assuring communication, and how are we assuring knowledge and sight? I mean, it's, postcards mailed to every residence and signs all around it's one step short of knocking on everybody's door. So
Again, I think this,
I'm struggling to understand how we're going to guarantee communication, because that sounds like people only want to move forward unless we guarantee communication, and I'm struggling to understand the definition of terms. Is when is success and when is not success? Do we only move forward if we have some sense of communication success? And I'm struggling with that, to understand that in practical terms. What does that mean our staff actually does from this action? I feel for the staff, frankly, is what are we going to be telling them to do in the next 2 weeks?
and we're asking the developer to do something he's not required to do.
And so I'm struggling with, this is a very ambiguous ask to table a thing with no clear direction or no clear anything really other than communicate. And I struggle for what that actual walk away and do something is. So I'm not supportive of tabling with basically just communicate.
And my concern again is we're mixing an issue that has caused consternation in the neighborhood, and that issue is not before us tonight. That is not our issue tonight. The fact that the developer is moving forward to get further movement on lots that were approved, that he's going to build single-family homes on, that they initially offered to us, and that is what we're going forward on. Again, I'm going to ask you, and I know there are concerns with the neighbors, and the neighbors have valid concerns about what we're doing with the property that we own. What the developer is doing by right with the property he owns is the issue we're dealing with here tonight. And I really encourage you to take a look at that motion. So we have a vote on the motion to table. Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
No.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
No.
Mr. Preston?
No.
Mayor Kus?
No. The motion to table fails. So we're back to the original set of 3 resolutions. And I think we've discussed that. So please call the roll on item 7, a resolution approving an amended preliminary subdivision plan for Blackstone Trail subdivision.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Ms. Smith?
No.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
I'm sorry to do this on the vote. Can we go back through if this ends up being a 3-3 right now, the motion does not
The
carry.
motion to approve this subdivision plan fails, and the developer has to, what process does the developer have to go through?
They can respond to that.
What, if this motion fails, what process does the developer have to go through?
The developer would take legal action to enforce the contract.
Yeah. I know this is probably out of order, but I made my initial comments, and I should have added one more thing into that. I understand that the developer is, in substantial compliance or substantially similar to what was originally proposed, and that as this ordinance reads, it should be approved. And my point was the engagement that I've had with the neighbors there at Blackstone Trails, and that I was, in light of that, wanting to take a vote in principle on this, but made that comment, not wanting to now be seemingly, by counting to the 2 of us that are left, be the one that's going to decide, what kind of situation this puts the town in. So with that, because of the vote at hand, while I still feel as strongly, in support of the neighborhood as I have from the beginning, but, in this situation, I can't make the town subject to potential legal action on what we're voting for. It does cross the boxes, so I'll vote aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye, the resolution is approved. Item 8 is a resolution conditionally approving the final plat of the second addition to Blackstone Trails. Motion for approval.
Move approval.
Second.
Second.
Thank you. Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Ms. Smith?
No.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. Item 9 is an ordinance rezoning the property in the town of Normal, Blackstone Trails Detention Basin. Please call, motion for approval.
Move approval.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
No.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. So we have a tie vote on that. We have not,
Nope. No.
No, it's 4.
4-2, I'm sorry. Somebody's going to have to teach me how to count. So that ordinance is approved as well. Item 10 is a motion to initiate a zoning text amendment concerning the regulation of a cannabis facilities. Motion for approval?
Move approval.
Second.
There was a request by council to get some information from the business community and the police, and I know John Walsh, if he can is it Bloomington representing the chamber, and he's going to try and break away and get to that, but I don't see him in the audience at this point.
He's there.
Mr. Welsh is here, but I think,
Oh.
He snuck in.
I believe the Chamber of Commerce was planning to respond to questions if council had questions, but they
gotcha.
don't have a specific presentation to make, and I do appreciate Mr. Walsh joining us after being at the Bloomington work session. He serves on the Bloomington Task Force, and so has just joined us.
So are there questions for police or the business community being represented by the
Yeah,
chamber?
I will point out that Chief Bleichner has some information at council's request during our work session. Council had, I believe Ms. Lorenz and others perhaps asked questions about the impact on law enforcement. So Chief Bleichner is prepared to share a little bit of, kind of from a law enforcement perspective, if council's interested in that. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, that's correct. I have a few things that I will kind of go into. A lot of it, though, it'll be relatively brief because, I'm not up here to give my opinion on these things. I can certainly tell you from what I've seen and heard from my counterparts in other states where this has been legalized, and from who've gone through this, some of the concerns, and then addressing that and what the proposed ordinance is. So certainly I can then respond to other questions that you may have. Some of the biggest complaints that I hear from other municipalities or from the police chiefs and other municipalities when these are passed, when it's recreationalized, is a lot of times is the odor, the smell of cannabis, whether it's burning or raw cannabis, from one business to another. So I would say specifically that the setbacks, if approved, is going to be critical in that. Some municipalities will look at it and choose to treat it like alcohol. I can tell you from in my experience and when we've had arrests and we've had large seizures, you could have a case of beer sitting in the middle of the room and sealed and you're not going to smell it. You have a case size raw cannabis, it's throughout the whole building. So that is something that would be, again, something that you'd want to take into consideration, I would think, when you're approving these things. On-premise consumption is another thing that is addressed in the ordinance, and that was something that a lot of my counterparts, again, in other states shared as a concern. It seems to make perfect sense if you've got a situation where you're allowing people to consume on premise, they then walk away or they drive away, you then have a situation where you potentially have impaired individuals behind the wheel. And in some cases, again, states where this has been legalized, you then have individuals under the influence and they then become victims because they're not fully capable of doing things that they normally would if they weren't impaired. And so again, they're easier to be victimized. So in those cases, again, the ordinance that's proposed prohibits that, and I would strongly support that if you decide to go forward with that. Some of the other concerns that we would have from a law enforcement standpoint are typically, the way it's set up now, it's a cash business primarily, and with that comes some potential opportunities and concerns, and there are some security concerns that are built into the ordinance. Again, we would not want that to be a location where individuals then see that as a easy opportunity to commit crimes, and so that would be something, again, if you decide to move forward with that, that we would strongly encourage that we're involved in some of the safety plans there as the ordinance has proposed. Again, those are the things that I think before you when it comes to making that decision. Philosophically, you're going to have to make your own decisions, but those are some things that I've identified just again from looking at the information from other municipalities and police departments who have gone through this, and those are some of the things that they've shared with us.
Questions for the chief?
I've got one. Chief, you talk about the odor. One of the things that in this item that I keep going back to, and I think it's probably just my real estate mind, is looking at the amount of distance for buffers that we're talking about here with reference to different zonings. Is there any general rule of thumb, and I'm sure it's entirely subjective, but on how much the impact of the odor, it typically would carry. So if you're 100 feet away on a non-windy day with a normal amount of recreational cannabis by...
I'd have to interrupt and say, what day is that in Illinois when it's not windy?
Not today.
the question that I'm trying to get to is the, the 100 to 200 feet buffers, are those seemingly reasonable as it relates to odor carrying? Is there any research on that?
I haven't seen that study, although if there's grant funding out there, I'm sure somebody would take it up. But again, I don't have a great handle on that. I would certainly say the further the better. Mr. Day could certainly kind of specify on that. I believe does allow up to 1,500 feet or something like that. We could. But again, the further the better in those cases. Again, just because that's one of the main complaints that we hear in business areas or residences. Those are the biggest problems we see.
Thanks for identifying me as an expert on cannabis odor.
You did a pretty good
The 1,500 feet is actually in the state statute as a limitation between two different dispensaries or from a cultivation center to another cultivation center. It's not between any residents or anything else.
That's good.
A question on that related to what Mr. Preston just asked is, there is no allowance in the state ordinance, or do we have to make allowance in our ordinances that deals with on-site consumption at a place that sells?
Well, I think,
My understanding is it's not allowed.
well, I think you could read it a couple of ways. I believe that it talks about you can't consume it in a public place, and if it was a one of these locations, definitely a dispensary would be something that's open to the public. But then it goes on to specify further that you can limit consumption on premise, and so that's when it's called out. I would believe then that's the reason for addressing it in the ordinance and prohibiting it specifically.
Yeah,
State
my reference.
statute allows on-premises consumption inside of a licensed dispensary, but it gives municipalities the option to prohibit that on-premises consumption.
And I think this discussion came up as part of our initial discussion last meeting, which was very clear this council had no interest in, if such an ordinance would pass, that we would have the equivalent of Amsterdam marijuana cafes in our community, that any consumption would be done on private premises. And we have the option to do that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
I have more questions for Mr. Day as follow-up to his presentation. So do we have any clarification as to whether or not the medical dispensary that currently exists in Normal could add recreational licensing and do both, or is that still up for interpretation?
I think we're still waiting to hear from the state on how that would work.
And if the town of Normal authorizes cannabis businesses, I understand we're allowed up to 3
In a two-county area.
in a 2-county area. So if we were to say yes, could we limit it to 1 for the town of Normal, or can we not limit it once we say yes?
When we say 3, that is up to 3 depending on what the current medical licensee opts to do. With new licenses, they're limited right now to 1 within the Bureau of Labor Statistics district, which is McLean and DeWitt County. So there would be 1 new license issued. On top of that, an existing medical licensee has the option of doing recreation at the existing facility and 1 more within that BLS district. So there would be 1, if the existing medical licensee wants to expand, there could be up to 3.
So the individual who spoke last week as a veteran who indicated that there are veterans who treat themselves with what qualifies as recreational marijuana because their diagnosis does not fall under the 60 that are specified in acceptable treatment for medical marijuana, they would still need to buy their product from a recreational dispensary.
Right, there's no expansion of any of the medical marijuana categories under the state statute.
Is it possible to get those diagnoses?
I'm not sure I know what you're asking.
The 60 diagnoses that are included in that legislation restricting medical marijuana?
Is it possible to get them expanded?
No, is it possible to get, just to get the listing of those 60
Oh.
diagnoses?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, it's probably in the-
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
I've heard that in Illinois, the municipalities that are going to allow it, well, even in normal, we don't know all the ramifications of if we allow it. So there are municipalities that are waiting, because even from a police point of view, you don't know all the issues, is what I'm understanding. So if we don't allow it now, we can always allow it later after we find out what issues pop up. Is that your understanding as well?
I think that's more of a Mr. Day question in
Mr.
terms
Day.
of, I would assume, once you, if an elected body prohibits, they could change their mind down the road and adopt an ordinance potentially, but the licenses may have already been issued.
Right,
elsewhere.
yeah, there's a schedule of when licenses are being rolled out, so it's possible if we were to wait a year or two, we would probably have missed the licenses that the state were going to issue.
Well, we may have missed that, but it would be a business decision from the business owner if they think it's better to relocate from where they're at to a municipality that's now more favorable for their business. It's just a matter of location. Because even if we say yes, we can't guarantee that a business wants to open here. They may decide they still want to open somewhere else.
Correct.
All we're doing is making it a potential place. So I'm more in favor of waiting and seeing what happens and then making the decision later. Because once we take that genie out of the bottle, we can't put her back in.
And yes, if I could just kind of explain to folks what the action is that we're asking council tonight is just a follow-up from our work session discussion. Whereas if council votes in favor of the item on the agenda, which is motion to initiate a zoning text amendment, that starts the process. So it would be on the Planning Commission agenda for their Thursday, November 7th meeting, where they would have a public hearing and there would be discussion, basically a public engagement process. People can come and speak and share their thoughts with the Planning Commission. That does then also provide the opportunity for planning commissioners to work with staff in response to citizen comments and such to make potential amendments to the ordinance if they believe that the ordinance as drafted should be amended. For example, one of the things we talked about earlier was the buffers. The item that's on the screen reflects the potential zoning classifications where certain uses could be allowed per the proposed ordinance, such as the B1 and M1 and M2 areas in agriculture for either dispensary or a cultivation center and such. And so we covered all that 2 weeks ago. What this action does tonight, though, is then, as mentioned, brings it to the Planning Commission, goes through the public process. The Planning Commission then can react and can modify the buffers, can change perhaps the zoning classifications or such, and provide a recommendation then to council. So it ultimately would come back to you again. At the earliest, it would be December, but that assumes that the Planning Commission's only going to have deal with all this action in one meeting.
Right.
I don't know if that's realistic. But if everything got accomplished in November and they heard everything they wanted to hear and were comfortable in making a recommendation, it would come back to council in December, where you can then either decide to accept the recommendation and approve it, reject it, or prohibit altogether. So that would be the process.
Mr. McCarthy?
A couple of follow-ups. So moving forward with an actual ordinance has to come back to us, is what I understood last time, and making sure I'm still on the same page with this discussion tonight. And so, although we're kind of talking about it, but not talking about it. If we do this tonight, it goes to the planning commission and then opens up another public opportunity to put input. Is that?
Correct.
That's a very public, I mean, all planning commissions meetings are open. It gives the public an opportunity to come and weigh in there on how they feel about it, pro, con, yes, but, no, but. All of the input is an opportunity for them to collect it if we move forward. But again, we still have so you said yes, no, but we could also wait if this group decided, which was been discussed already. So that would be yet the third option. I'm not sure. Maybe you said that and I just missed that, but.
Right, when it comes back to council,
You're right.
ultimately, in terms of a proposed ordinance, then council can decide to accept it, to modify it, to reject it altogether, and to prohibit cannabis sales in normal.
My feeling on this, and I don't have a strong opinion one way or another as to the final ordinance. I think there's more information that we need. But I do believe it deserves a public hearing. It's an issue that is very polarizing in the community. There are people very strongly against it. There are people that want it to happen. And I think it deserves at least a public hearing. Mr. Preston.
Yep, so I understand process entirely as well. So if there is, in this draft ordinance that we have tonight, if there is a change or an alteration to that I would be interested in putting forth, would tonight be an appropriate conversation to do that, or would that be something that is not as pertinent to this conversation as it would be, presumably when it came back after going to planning?
I think it would be helpful to do that when it comes back to us, after we hear what the public has to say about it. And there'll be ample opportunity to do that.
Just so I'm on record, even though I won't be making the request for an amendment, the buffer zones of 100 feet for residential, or excuse me, for churches and schools and the like, and 200 for residential, I believe, or vice versa. That is a very small buffer. I mean, 100 feet is, the width, just side to side, of a lot of residential lots. That can be your neighbor on your left is a house, your neighbor on the right, is a cannabis business, and that would meet that requirement. So I'm now on.
Mr. Day, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have significant control over our buffer zones in our local ordinance. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is correct. And in fact, the ones in the ordinance were just ones we put in as placeholders for the planning commission to discuss. We're not committed to those particular ones. We just used our existing buffers from liquor, but certainly we put those in with the understanding that that would be probably one of the biggest areas of discussion on this.
Right, we did see that as the absolute bare minimum, and figured that it would be easier to expand the buffer rather than come into council with a proposed ordinance with a large buffer and then try to contract it later. So we started with what we believe was probably the bare minimum, and certainly expect that we're going to hear a number of comments about expanding the buffer.
Yeah.
I would go on record with you, Mr. Preston. I don't think the buffers are broad enough. I think there should be stricter regulation on that, and we'll have the opportunity to do that. Ms. Lorenz and Mr. Nord.
Okay, I do have some questions for our representative from the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Good evening.
Hi. So do you plan to survey the business community? I think that was an idea surfaced, perhaps I think it was by Mr. Nord and others when we last discussed this. Will you be making a presentation at the next public hearing if that comes to pass?
So the Chamber's Board of Directors did not take a position on the legislation as it went through the legislature, and exactly for the reason you guys are talking about tonight. There are a lot of folks on all sides of the fence on this one. We have not done a survey at this point because without a finalized zoning map, we felt like it didn't make a ton of sense. And as with the planning commission process and the zoning process, we believe there's also ample opportunity for businesses to come and give individualized statement if that's what they'd like to do. As far as giving an official presentation at a council meeting, that's certainly something that we could do if that's something that you would like to have happen.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nord?
If we vote this down tonight, are we still able to do public engagement?
I'm sorry.
If we vote this down tonight, are we still able to do public engagement?
No point.
Well, I suppose we're always able to do public engagement. I'm not sure if you're talking about just gathering information on people's interests, because we have a proposed ordinance to react to, so I'm not sure what kind of public engagement you would be suggesting.
Just to get information from the public as to if they think the setbacks need to be further away, what their general thoughts are, yay or nay, because if we go down the route of voting yes, then we're going to be I assume we're going to be committing a lot of key staff time to investigating this. And if we need input from the community, that's, I guess, one level of work. But then if we also need more detailed information on zoning issues, that's, in my mind, I think, a higher level of work and input that needs to be done. And if we wait, we're going to hear zoning issues that have occurred in other communities, and they may tell us, hey, 200 feet is not enough, maybe it needs to be 400 feet, or other things that we just don't know because we're doing a lot of speculation here. And we can always approve this later. Saying we prohibit it doesn't set it in stone indefinitely. We can always say yes once we get more information.
So what we're trying to do here, Mr. Nord, is move the process into a public hearing. As I have done in past meetings where issues are very controversial, such as this, I will likely suspend the public comment rules and allow people significant time to talk to the council about this. So that would give two opportunities for people to speak out on this. And I agree, it's an issue of controversy in the community, and so all parties need to be heard, and we should give them the opportunity to do that. And I think taking it to the Planning Commission is part of that process. Again, we're not passing anything by taking it to Planning Commission. The ultimate decision will be made by the council in December or January, whenever that comes to us. And I certainly agree that we need to give the public plenty of opportunity to weigh in on this. Mr. McCarthy and then Ms. Smith.
Just to be clear, Mr. Nord brought up staff time, and I'm always sensitive to wasting staff time, so, and taxpayer dollars, therefore. But so if this goes to the Planning Commission, the work on the draft ordinance has already been done. Is that?
That is true. Staff then would just be in a position to modify the draft in response to council's comments and concerns, in response to citizen input, in response to input and reaction from the planning commissioners. So we would modify the ordinance accordingly, and then staff would do put the time in that we do for any other planning commission meeting in terms of posting notice and providing reports and recommendations to the planning commission.
So if I understood that, between now and a planning commission, not much staff time, only after input from commissioners and citizens in that public process, then that would
Correct.
involve staff time to modify.
Massaging the ordinance
Okay.
to try to address what we hear.
Okay.
And
Just-
then coming back to council with their ultimate recommendation.
Just wanted to make sure. I thought we'd already front-ended the time. The work's already been done, and then the work will be done later.
And Mr. Nord, I didn't want to take away from your comment on that, because I understand that your position may be that you don't want to take any action on this at this point, and I understand that and respect that. But, in terms of getting the public input, to my mind, taking it to the Planning Commission is a good start. Again, it doesn't commit us to any action. That is something that we as a council will deal with later. Ms. Smith? And I think we're going to wrap this up.
So if my understanding is correct, the up to 3 is what's available to Normal, or is that what's available to Bloomington, Normal, and McLean County?
It's actually what's available to McLean County and DeWitt County combined.
Okay. Have we heard of any surrounding municipalities that are going to approve it? So how close is the closest recreational facility? Since, again, the only person who spoke in favor of this at the previous council was a veteran whose condition was not necessarily on the list of 60 treatable with medical marijuana. And if we're locating that facility here, those individuals, if they choose to pursue this, how far away would they have to do it? Do we know that yet?
One thing I would add to that is, you know, because of state law, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Mr. Day, they could go to another municipality. Bloomington is having this conversation. They had a work session on that tonight. But also, a potential dispensary or point of sale could be in the unincorporated areas of the county if the county were to approve it. So it isn't just municipalities. It could be in unincorporated areas in the county. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
And yeah, as far as, I don't remember if Champaign's formally approved it. I know Peoria recently has approved it.
Okay.
In terms, just real quick, Mr. Knorr brought up a point about if we deny it now, we can approve it later. As I'm frantically scrolling through the 600-page piece of legislation, I don't know that that's been addressed anywhere in the legislation about changing locations once it's been awarded. So if somebody were to get a license in the initial rollout of licenses in DeWitt County, and then we later approve it, I don't think they could then just say, well, now we want to move to Normal. I think they would probably risk, at least as I'm initially reading the statute, they would risk losing their license altogether. And so we probably, at some point, I suspect the General Assembly will address that, but right now it doesn't look as if they've made any type of allocation for relocating any facilities.
Thank you. Mr. Preston?
Yep, it'll be quick. Just a final question for Mr. Walsh, since he's still here with us. I understand that the Chamber Board has decided not to take a position up till this point. Once there is more concrete proposal in front of us on the tail end after going to planning, if this process does move forward tonight, is the Chamber planning to take a position at that point?
So the Bloomington City Council this evening as well in their work session said that that's something that they would like to see. So I imagine if that's something that you would like to see as well, it is something that we can certainly consider as well with the time frame that you're operating in. I think it is manageable. The general conversations that we've been having at this point is the legislation really provides very strong workplace and employer protections for those that want to retain a drug-free workplace. Workplace means more than just a physical building. It means your parking lot, and if you have any fleet vehicles, if you have anybody on call. So there are very strong workplace and employer protections given in the legislation, and that's one of the things that we'll be working with our membership on. Frankly, regardless if Bloomington or Normal choose to opt out or not, those are still challenges that the business community is going to face. Especially, the legislation amends the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act. So essentially, the legislation gives employers the ability to keep that drug-free workplace, but it also says, you can't tell employees what they can do in their time. Which is essentially what the same challenge that the municipalities are facing as well. So as far as that, we're working with our membership to help them draft those workplace policies and build the reasonable suspicion checklists that are given in the legislation. So we're, long way to say, we're operating the same pretty much either way. Now that said, that's definitely something I can take to the board, and that's definitely a request you can make of the board.
I'd like to see it if that would be something you guys are interested in.
I think so. The motion before us is to initiate a zoning text amendment to move this to Planning Commission. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Nay.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The motion is approved. That concludes our general orders. We have one item of new business and ordinance authorizing the town to execute a loan agreement with Commerce Bank for $2 million to be used to refund the callable remaining principal payments on the town's Series 2009 fixed-rate bond issue.
Move approval.
Thank you.
Second.
Discussion on this item. Ms. Smith?
I had reached out to Ms. Rees for clarification because if anything would qualify for net present value analysis, the comparison would benefit from having that included in the calculations because the closing costs are in today's dollars, but the interest savings occur in the future in years 3 and 4. I did see that looking at tonight's business news that the rate that we're refinancing is close to the 2-year Treasury bond rate, so it looks like it is a good rate. But how does it change the numbers when we make that net present value calculation?
Sure. Thank you for that question. We did do a net present value calculation in response to your inquiry. It looks like the interest savings would be about $129,000 in net present value, so still a significant savings. I'll invite Mr. Hune to come forward and respond to any further questions you might have. But what we're asking council to do tonight is authorize a refunding of the callable portion of the 2009 bond issue that is outstanding, and we think it's a great story. We had a number of significant responses and from local businesses and financial institutions for our business, and we're very pleased with that. We're proud to recommend a refunding with Commerce Bank, and I know the Commerce Bank folks are here if council has any questions, but Mr. Hune has done the analysis and is prepared to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. McCarthy?
As I have done since 2012 when this comes up, is to thank our finance department and our bond counsel, Misro Financial, for staying on top of this, of paying attention to when market conditions are favorable for us to save taxpayer dollars. Budgeting is hard, saving dollars is hard, cutting expenses is hard at times. But any opportunity to do something like this is about market savvy and paying attention and being on top of it. And we really appreciate staff because that goes right to the taxpayers' bottom line. So we really appreciate you staying on top of that. Thanks to Commerce and all the local banks that were willing to step up and help save the taxpayers' dollars as well. We really appreciate the local support. I was impressed by the large number of local banks that were willing to take a risk on the town of Normal. Clearly, they believe in us as much as we believe in them, so I appreciate all the local banks as well.
I'm sure that Fitch AAA rating made their decision a little bit easier.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add, I don't want it to go, it has been noticed, but it's an important uniqueness to this transaction. We typically use one underwriter, and then that underwriter sells to the open market. This is the first refunding we've done where we've offered it to various banks in the community at a local level. They were very responsive, very active, and happy to participate. We did get wonderful rates from all of them. Commerce came through with the lowest rate, 1.7 and 1.8% for both the maturities. It's something we haven't done in the past. We did it this time because it was a relatively small refunding in comparison to the ones we've done in the past. We've done about 6 now. In the last 10 years, some of it had some pretty significant savings, but they've also been very large refundings. This one was a little smaller, and we thought it kind of met the market needs for our local banks, and they're anxious to consider larger ones in the future. So my hats off to them for coming forward, and we worked with them very closely, and it's been a very good process and a savings to the town in terms of taxpayer dollars for interest on our debt.
Mr. Hyun, what's the current inflation rate in the country?
Oh, well, I'm hearing like 2% or something like that. I'm not sure what it's at right now, but this is slightly below inflation. Put me on the spot there.
The other thing to point out is the 2009 bond issue is a 3.5% interest rate. So this is significant.
Cutting it
Right, right, exactly.
Mr. Nord?
With the previous bond, was it paid for with like any particular funds? Was it earmarked to like property tax, or sales tax or any specific type of money?
Sure. When the bond program started back in 2003, this council designated a fair amount of different revenue sources to support the bond issue. A quarter cent of the 1% of the 1% or the 1.5% sales tax, a portion of food and beverage, a portion of hotel motel. Obviously, Uptown TIF increment was going to also support it, as well as some federal subsidies. So there was a myriad of different town taxes that were going to support our debt capacity for the program, and those continue to fund them to this day.
And I want to point out, though, that we do not have a property tax levy to support our bond payments. So it is not applied to the levy.
Okay, in the documentation, the loan documentation, it mentioned something about a tax levy and the amount.
Sure.
It's always abated.
Correct. Yeah, every ordinance that we issue a bond for, there's a requirement that it's a GO bond has to have some tax tied to it. So the ordinance always specifies a property tax. The county would levy that tax unless this bite takes action to abate it, which simply says we have the money in place already paid off. No property tax will be needed for this. And this council, by practice and policy, has always abated those taxes since the beginning we've issued them. So this is no different. This is simply a refunding of a current bond issue that's currently being entirely abated in terms of taxes for property tax.
Okay, and the payment stream's the same? We're going to end up paying off this loan in the same number of years?
Correct. We don't extend when we do refunding, we don't extend the debt at all. We simply do what we call a vanilla version of the debt. We keep the terms the same. Final maturities are the same. We just enjoy better savings and interest.
Well, then I got to give you credit. This is fantastic that you're saving the town $129,000. So keep going. Look anywhere to see what else you can save, because if you find 10 of these, now we're over $1 million in savings. So keep it up.
Well, we've had actually bigger refunding savings in this in the past, but I certainly will. I thank you for your compliment. We actually look at this stuff all the time, and again, it's a relatively minor savings, but no savings is too minor in our opinion, and we will always go after those things. But I think the uniqueness of this transaction is when we do have savings, albeit different than the larger ones we've had in the past, but it's also a great use of our local institutions in terms of commerce this time to support the town's debt and support the town's capital projects.
I've got one last question. The savings, the $129,000 in savings, will that money go to pay this bond off sooner, or what's that money going to be used for?
Essentially, that money kind of falls to our bottom line debt service fund. So what essentially happens is the debt we paid off at the same time. We're not paying the debt off faster. We're just paying less amount for it during that time frame. But that savings at 129 is essentially going to remain in the debt service project fund and essentially beef up our ability to pay debt further off in the future. It's not allocated to anything but debt, so we will leave it there. So essentially, the fund balance in our debt sinking fund is going to increase by that amount, and then that'll help us in the future fund the debt on other debt issues.
When Andrew did his financial trends report in the September meeting, one of the graphs talks about debt service and project reserve, and that's where these savings will be. They'll be placed into that reserve.
And I guess really in direct terms, the general fund will have to fund less from its resources now to pay this particular bond issue off, because it's cheaper to pay off now than it was before the refunding. So money is essentially freed up in the general fund, in essence.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved. Before taking a motion for adjournment, are there concerns or comments? Mr. Preston?
Yep, I'll start off and say happy homecoming week to Illinois State. While we did not have a ceremony to go along with it, I did notice driving here this evening that the lights are up and on all the trees in Uptown. I mean, they provided a good energy and certainly glad to be celebrating ISU this and every week. So I've got my Redbird socks on, and hope everybody enjoys homecoming weekend this coming weekend for those who don't partake.
Great, thank you. Mr. Nord and then Mr. McCarthy.
I'd like to echo the Christmas trees, or the lights on the trees. It's very nice. It reminds me of when I lived in Chicago, but I hope we get some snow, because then it really brightens up everything as well. I know people are going to kind of throw snowballs at me when they see me now, but
Not me, I'm with you, Mr. Nord.
yeah, I live in Illinois for a reason. I like the seasons. Something that I wanted to bring up was our state leaders are publicly now saying that they want to address the skyrocketing property taxes in our state. And as a council, we need to realize that for our local property taxes, we are the 7 that control that here for what Normal's piece of that is. So in order for us to address that, taxpayers need a minimum of 4 of us to do the things that are required in order to have our property taxes be lowered. So I urge that we can start having discussions on different options that we can implement to make that happen for our taxpayers. There's a lease that the town has. This lease is time sensitive. The lease automatically renews come December 1st if the council does nothing. This lease is a free rent lease, and if we don't know anything about it, it automatically renews for yet another year. So I would like this lease to be addressed and looked at and see if we can try and get market rate rent. It's for a property here in Uptown. I know there are businesses that are looking for property in Uptown, so let's take advantage of that and try and get some more revenue by, either raising the rent rate to market rate for the current tenant, or, find a tenant that will do that. The IML magazine in Illinois Municipal League, we're members of that.
Yes?
Yeah. This was on my desk here last session, and I just wanted to read a few pieces out of it. They talked about municipal theft and lessons learned. This was all based off of the Dixon, Illinois incident that happened. But I thought it was kind of fitting. Some of the lessons. It says, pay attention when employees fail to follow policies, particularly on financial matters. And I'm not saying this to point fingers or make assumptions. This is just in the magazine, and something that we should just understand. This is our role. Some municipalities might have unintentionally been relaxing those financial standards. Some municipalities may not have ever changed their practices, convinced that it could not happen here. The lesson of the largest municipal theft in the United States history is that financial safeguards must be reviewed regularly. Every local government should renew its financial policies and procedures, making changes as necessary. If your municipality already assessed its financial controls 7 years ago, in the wake of Dixon, do it again. Financial safeguards are not something to set and forget. They should be reviewed regularly and make people sure and make sure people are still following each required step, rather than utilizing convenient but insecure workarounds. Are the appropriate individuals affiliated with the municipality engaged in the process of establishing, using, and maintaining internal control systems? All the safeguards in the world will not matter if the people required to use them do not fully understand the requirements. Policies must clearly lay out those requirements and restrictions. Expectations must also be clearly made. One of the problems in Dixon was that the city's monitoring failed. An auditing firm regularly audited the city's finances as required by law. Routine audits are not designed to catch fraud. They offer more a bird's eye view of city's finances. Aside from the annual audit, municipal officers must also conduct their own regular investigations into municipalities' finances. These investigations would not focus on actual dollars and cents, but on the internal financial controls. The review should be conducted by 2 people separately, looking to see if employees and officials are properly following the guidelines. Perhaps the best safeguard at the monitoring stage is the city council or board of trustees. Board members have the advantage of being outsiders to a certain degree. They can look at data from a different perspective and ask questions about any transaction that seems questionable. Boards should not rubber stamp. They should be watchdogs. Then the next page, this was an article by someone that actually does the fraud investigations. And just some comments he said was, in spite of good internal controls, good people, and external audits, fraud is still occurring. I would argue that it happens at almost every business or local government. Things like filling a personal vehicle with gas from a township fuel supply to stealing office supplies for a project at home doesn't sound like a big deal. But I think we need to face the reality that fraud probably exists in your entity, and the sooner you realize that it could be happening to you, the sooner you will start to spot your vulnerabilities and the red flags of a larger problem. The CPA is usually pretty clear when they do an audit that they are performing a financial statement audit and not looking for fraud. Something that this guy has mentioned is every year, or this is cases that he's working on. He says, you have an audit every year. Congratulations. 3 of the 3 current criminal cases had an audit every year. You have good internal controls. Congratulations. 3 of 3 current cases I'm working on had decent internal controls. You have loyal employees that has been with you for a number of years. Congratulations. You guessed it. 3 out of 3 cases have these characteristics as well. Let's face it, quit thinking that fraud is always someone else's problem. Check over your people's work randomly and independently and verify information. So I thought that was very fitting. This is something that, I don't know, I didn't bring up because I want to point fingers. This is just something that the IML publishes too. So I think we should all read the information that they're putting out. Thank you.
I would agree with you on that. And I would say that I have full faith in staff that is happening, and I have full faith in the council that they indeed are watchdogs of the public dollar and their actions. It is something to be concerned about. There's no question about it. I will say, can we do a better job? Can staff do a better job on that? Of course, everyone can always do a better job. But I would say that I stand by staff's ability to pay attention to that, and there have been isolated incidences, which I can't say right now, in the past where we have indeed found isolated issues of fraud and dealt with it accordingly in terms of terminations and demanding restitution. So your point's well taken. We need to be watchdogs. Mr. McCarthy.
On a completely different note and tone, although I may be one of the only ones that wasn't here, I got text messages and emails and even videos of the Rivian event that happened over the weekend. Unfortunately, I was out of town and couldn't attend, but I can't recall a public event in Uptown Normal where I've gotten such feedback from the public, overwhelmingly positive, and congratulations. Obviously not for just me, but everybody who's been a part of helping support the Rivian success story happening here in Normal, and I'm really bummed I didn't get to see the vehicles up close and personal, but at least a dozen people reached out to express their satisfaction and happiness and hopefulness about what's coming for Rivian. So I'm very happy that they decided to do that and finally show the public here in Normal the vehicles, and so they could actually feel them and touch them and talk to the people. So they need to keep going.
Ms. Smith.
Oh, wouldn't let them touch, all right.
I understand that in the past, there was a practice of coffee with a council person that kind of fell by the wayside. And in an effort to respond to residents who I think her primary complaint was that they weren't being heard, I'd like to offer an opportunity to meet with residents and would invite another council member to join me so that they could have an opportunity to express their point of view, and we could have an opportunity to alert them to the upcoming budget sessions and other actions that are on the agenda and the calendar for the council, so that we can take the message to them where they are. And I'll be reaching out to the citizen who had contacted me before the meeting to try to see if she might coordinate with me and Ms. Reese to see if there are some scheduling issues that I need to worry about. I understand there should only be 2 of us there, so I would welcome another council member joining me in that effort.
Ms. Lorenz?
Well, I didn't have anything, but I want to build upon things that both Ms. Smith and Mr. Nord said, just very briefly, in the interest of time. All the Queen's Horses, Mr. Nord, is the name of a documentary film that outlines the Dixon situation. It's a very, very good Netflix, I believe, movie, and might have even run at the Normal Theater a few years ago.
It did.
So maybe a movie night for the council. And then to Ms. Smith, I've been thinking about the same thing, actually, to maybe rethink the Coffee with Council, maybe give it a little bit of a different twist, something maybe we can talk about at our upcoming strategic planning.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Motion for adjournment, please.
So moved. Second.
That was enthusiastic. Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye, we are adjourned.
Yes, sir. Stand. I'll make sure I understand.
Yeah. The,
Nothing is going on to substantiate the contractual obligations other than some
right, oh,
plywood.